Welcome to RSA Conference 2023. We are back live in Broadcast Alley. It's so good to be back in the middle of the conference. I'm your host, Matt Alderman. For this interview segment, we have Randy Watkins. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Critical Start. Welcome, Randy.
Thanks, Matt. Glad to be here.
We're going to talk about managed detection and response.
Sounds good. I know a little bit about that.
Good. So one of the kind of precursors for this is this discussion about skills gap, right? We actually did a pre-recorded session that aired today on Business Security Weekly talking about is it a headcount problem or is it a skills problem? I'd love your take because I want to see if you align to kind of where we concluded. Like, what is the challenge when it comes to security resources?
I'm going to go with a firm yes. It's kind of both, right? It's a headcount problem and it's also a skills problem. You can put as many headcount as you want there, but if they don't know what they're doing, then you're kind of in the same boat. So what we're seeing is a combination of the two. And the headcount shortage that we're seeing is more the seasoned professionals that really understand how to investigate and respond to some of the alerts. But there's also the headcount problem of doing that really basic, rudimentary Tier 1 and 2 triage. And a lot of that was taken over by automation. But as attackers start to change their TTPs, the automation doesn't necessarily keep up. You need new playbooks, and that kind of exacerbates that expertise gap. So you have an expertise shortage on the higher end where it's truly into the incident response, forensics, and then managing some of those automation platforms. And then you have the quantifiable headcount shortage on the lower end where it's doing that Tier 1 remediation and investigation of those basic alerts.
We just figured we'd let Meta lay off another few thousand people. We'll fix the headcount problem. We really boiled it down to a skills gap problem, which is, do we have the right skills to address this? And if you're an organization that doesn't have the headcount or the skills, then where do you go to get help, right? And I think that's where the whole MDR discussion starts to come in, right? This space has been evolving over the last couple of years. It's interesting to me because what I want to understand is when you talk about managed detection and response, a lot of people think about endpoint detection and response that's managed, right? Mm-hmm. Which is a very interesting take on it, which is different than the managed security service providers. But is it just managed EDR or is it more than that?
Now it's more than that. When MDR started, and I'd like to think that Critical Start was a pioneer in the MDR space because we've been doing it for about 7.5, going on 8 years, back when it was still MSSP and we were trying to talk about why it was different than MSSP. It was primarily EDR because EDR came on the scene and they gave us unrivaled visibility that we had never had before, and they gave us all this powerful detection capability that we started to leverage and generate so many alerts. But then what do you do with the alerts?
Right.
So MDR, we initially started off looking at products that were very heavy in the EDR space and gave us basic remediation capabilities or containment capabilities to isolate hosts and things like that. Then identity started to step up as more of the forefront that attackers were going after, and they were primarily leveraging that through email. So you start to bring in some of these other signals and start to really dive into root cause analysis of these attacks, and you realize that just covering endpoint isn't enough. Well, then we started to see a shift from messaging from folks like Microsoft into MXDR because XDR became a big thing.
Right.
So now we're in MXDR. It's really what analyst firm do you want to listen to in terms of what acronym you should align with. But really the MXDR is technically what we're delivering. We still deliver it under the umbrella of MDR, but MXDR is really just bringing in additional signals outside of endpoint, looking at identity, looking at email, looking at third-party signals coming in from a SIM to get more of a holistic view of an attacker's approach.
So you bring up another interesting term, XDR, right? We went from EDR to XDR. We went from managed MDR to managed MXDR, whatever it is. But where is the difference still between the old traditional MSSPs and this new kind of managed set of services? Because, you know, if I go look at the old managed security service providers, they're doing pieces of endpoint, they're doing pieces of XDR. Like, what really differentiates the MDR vendors from the MSSPs? Is there something missing, or is there something different, or the approach that really differentiates the old, I'll call them stodgy because I'm old, MSSPs versus like the new young kind of up and coming MDR vendors?
So I call them legacy. A
Okay.
little bit of a respectful tribute. But it's kind of a theological discussion that I'll pair back to when MSSPs were born. Security was born as a means to accomplish compliance. And in my mind, MSSPs were that checkbox. They were doing kind of minimum value add. They weren't really pursuing attackers. They were more escalating alerts. They were providing 24/7 support, but they weren't really doing anything with the data they were bringing in. So fast forward to today, the cost of a breach is almost outpacing the cost of noncompliance. So you see a mindset shift in CISOs today, and they're saying, you know what, it's not just about being compliant, it's about truly being secure, because I can't recover from the brand and reputation damage of an actual breach. So I need my MSSP to do more. I need them to actually contain 24/7, not just escalate these alerts to a team that's not responding to it.
Right.
We really just replaced alert fatigue from products with alert fatigue from MSSPs. So MDRs really started off with containment capabilities, really emphasizing that R in MDR. We're detecting, but we're also doing a thing. And that's where we kind of draw the line today. MSSPs are more console management. They're doing things like firewall rules management, and patch management. And now MDRs are doing more of the cyber threat prevention. And you do see MSSPs using the MDR. You do see some MSSPs truly delivering MDR. And I think you're going to continue to see that kind of be the line of delineation. Are you managing a device? Are you managing a technology? Or are you preventing and mitigating cyber risk?
Right. You just said an interesting word, preventing cyber risk. Now, when I think of detection and response, I think of signals coming in that are showing me something that's going on right now that I have to respond to as soon as possible to prevent a breach. Preventing attacks, it's a slightly different signal set. So do you cross over into some of the preventative capabilities, or do you focus more on the detection and response? Because sometimes it's the same signals, but it's presented in a slightly different way.
Yeah, kind of yes and yes. And if you're being semantically correct, I mean, anything detection and response is reactive, it's not proactive.
Right.
Maybe we're preventing a breach. So we're proactive in preventing a breach by stopping the attack. But really, the detection and response is reactive. What you're seeing now and what Gartner is demanding and Forrester is demanding is really starting to shift left a little bit and look at things like security posture. So we do, for example, configuration validation of all the products that we monitor. You know, garbage in, garbage out. We don't care if we tie into your EDR if it's improperly configured and set to the lowest settings. We want everything to be turned on. So there is more of a shift left, but even in the detection and response space, doing things like configurations validation still improves your security posture without requiring you to really shift left in terms of technology or timeline.
Yeah. Well, you said this earlier with the MSSPs, right? It was firewall rule management, then it was vulnerability detection, right? Kind of the basic stuff. But configuration has always been this big gap, I think, in the industry for a long time, having built the policy compliance module back at Qualys back in the day. It's like configuration matters. Like a misconfiguration is just as bad as a critical vulnerability, but you have to look at all those. So when you define MDR going forward, what are the things people need to think about from their MDR provider? Like what's in scope or should be in scope for an MDR service that people can start to really evaluate the market kind of more clearly now that we've kind of started to differentiate the differences between MSSPs and MDRs?
Yeah, so not to overtly plug our new white paper, but we did just release a white paper on the 10 things you kind of want to consider during the evaluations of your MDR and a couple of pitfalls to avoid. But looking at the space overall, an alignment from a technology and strategy perspective is first and foremost. There's a number of different vendors, you know, a couple 100 feet away that are down in the basement. If you have their technology, you definitely want to make sure your MDR supports it one way or another, whether it's reading in the signals or using it for response capabilities. Also, like the level of risk mitigation that they're going to perform in terms of alert resolution is key. One of the big differentiators we see across the space is SLAs. And there's a semantically overloaded term that they're using now called SLOs, where they're service level objectives. Essentially, it's best effort, but there's no contractual obligation to fulfill the duty. And that's kind of dangerous. Right, because you can miss your SLOs, but there's no real penalty.
There's no penalty in the contract for missing your SLO. Because,
Exactly. Either that or they'll align SLAs to critical, high, medium, and low. But who's to dictate what's a critical, high, medium, or low? Because routinely we see attackers using wall bins or live off the land binaries to skate through on medium and low alerts and not really set off the alarms. So you really do have to look at what is your MDR provider resolving and in what time period are they promising that resolution? And then to that point, is resolution. Are they actually going to contain the threat or are they going to recommend containment? It seems weird that you would be considered an MDR without the R, but we do still see that here and there, and Gartner actually differentiates between big R, little r. Little r being, hey, we'll contain the threat, big R being, we do have incident response capabilities.
Got it.
So if you don't have that in your plan, if you don't have an incident response playbook or anything like that, definitely leverage your MDR provider to move seamlessly from, hey, we've identified this attack, we've contained it, but we need to do litigation, you need to do legal disclosure, things like that.
Let's talk containment for a second, because you talked little r, big R. Do you need orchestration platforms to orchestrate some of this remediation, right? We've seen this kind of combination of the SIM and SOAR over the past few years. Can I just use a SIM for incident response and use a bunch of manual processes? Do I need to have a SOAR and execute playbooks? Like, is that something people should evaluate as part of their MDR provider, or doesn't it matter?
If you already have a SIM and a SOAR in place, it's good to ask your MDR provider how they're going to leverage your technology to do that response. If you don't have a SIM and SOAR in place, then it's good to ask your MDR provider what they use for the detection and response. Most MDR providers, including ourselves, are going to have a homegrown SOAR platform in the background. So really what customers should ask about is transparency to that SOAR platform and how it's being leveraged to respond more quickly to those threats. So it comes down to, do I get access to that platform? How do I see what you guys are doing? How do I validate what you're doing? And then how do you ensure quality assurance across your entire platform? Because MDRs can actually be just as disruptive as an attacker if you go through and start isolating endpoints with no real checks and balances in place. So everybody's going to use a SOAR. It's just a matter of how they use it. What access to it does the customer have, and is there quality assurance in place to make sure they're not, almost acting as bad as an attacker?
Yeah. I got one more question for you. It's kind of a curveball, but not really. When we think about breaches, 82, 86, 88% come from the human element, right? These have been things that have been published in the Verizon Data Breach Report for a long time. And if we're focused on the endpoint and the network and all these other things, do we have enough human context in these services to really help us understand where some of the human risk is in the environment? I'm just curious where this market continues to evolve, because we see the human still being the biggest component. So we know it's not just a technology problem anymore, but are we seeing some enhancements, some innovation to really understand the human element in these types of services to give us better context so that we can be a little more targeted also in some of our response activities?
Yeah, I mean, over the last couple of years, there's definitely been a resurgence in, going after users, going after their IDs, and we call it Layer 8. Layer 8 is obviously the most susceptible layer to attack, and it's also the cheapest for an attacker to go after with the lowest risk of getting caught. So actually, about 3 years ago, the term ITDR started to emerge, the Identity Threat Detection and Response. It was almost like a brother to MDR. But really, that's kind of merged together in the MXDR platform. And we do see enough signals if we're getting those signals. The problem is often that the customer doesn't have the necessary technology or they can't feed it to the right location to get the signals to properly align with the endpoint. And that's where true MXDR platforms like Microsoft with Sentinel, they really start to combine those signals to provide a great holistic view of the attack. So we can say, hey, it's a compromised machine, but it really started from a compromised user credential that's logged into 18 other machines. And then you can respond on both the endpoints and the identity and really kind of cut the attacker off from all angles.
And oh, by the way, they have privileged access and
Exactly.
all those other indicators.
Well, that's a good thing about some of these different identity providers is they're able to wrap in the context of what they have access to with the context of the riskiness, the risky actions of the user to give you that better view of this is the user account and it is compromised. Here's the blast radius given that compromised account.
So MDR expands to cover all the different angles. to provide customers a better detection and response capabilities. That's what I just heard today.
That's the goal. That's what we're after.
Awesome. Randy, thank you so much for joining us. If anybody wants to learn more, please visit securityweekly.com/critical start RSAC. Thank you for watching and listening.